Hey, hello Empire, Garrett here. Next segment on the leatherworking series. This is going to be part two. Part one, we covered how to lay a stitch line and how to use brick irons. Now we're going to teach, this lesson will be on saddle stitch. Saddle stitch is a very strong traditional stitch. I use it for all my armor work and pretty much everything. It's my bread and butter stitch. So we're going to cover how to do one today. It's actually quite easy. It just really does just take some time and practice. So to start with, we're going to be show you what needles I'm going to be using. I am using John James saddle harness needles. This is just the model for from where I bought it. I got these happen to be from Weaver's Leathercraft, but you can buy them in multiple things. They come in a pack of 25, and believe me, you'll probably lose them more often than you'll ever break them. They're very rugged needles, very strong, and I go through them. I'm very hard on my needles, and I've rarely ever broken them. I've lost way more than I care to admit. Okay, so first, let's see. With the needle, I'm going to go ahead and show you a trick. We're going to stitch the needle up. Come on. It's late on Sunday. I'm sorry. It's just been a long day. Okay, so let's go ahead. So I'm going to show you. Now, just in the meantime, if you're curious what this thing here is, this is called a stitching pony. This one's just happened to be made from scrap wood. And that'll probably be an early project. We'll show you how to make you one. I already have it. Alright, so we're going to take your thread. I'm doing some blue thread here for some background. Now, typically what I like to do with my thread and make it a lot easier to thread needles, I take me a little pair of scissors. I cut it a nice 45. Once again, I'll use my beeswax. This is an optional step. Sometimes you can put a little wax on the end. That'll make it go through the eye a little easier. And then I'm going to take the needle that I literally just dropped. Hence why I have little magnets on mine. Alright, so you're going to want to measure about 1.5 to 2 inches. You're going to put that needle right in the center. And you're going to pierce it through the center like that. Then we're going to push it up. Going to run the needle through that eye. Well, the thread through the eye. And then like there. And then you're going to push that all the way up. And this allows for me to tug on it, knock on it, and it's not going to slide off. So it locks your stitch in really good. And that's a great way how I do all my needles. Now, for the demo, what we have here is on the top line, we have 1 millimeter holes. This is great for new beginners. Bigger hole, if you have thicker needles, thicker thread. I usually only run a 0.8 millimeter thread. So I don't really use this very often. I don't like it because it removes the leather. I prefer to use my stitching iron down here below because this gives me a smaller hair hole, as well as this will heal itself up over time to a degree. So you get a much stronger and tighter stitch than as if you remove the leather. And then aesthetically speaking, I prefer the bottom brick and iron holes, but really it makes no difference for that regards. So now I have some preset needles here. So I'm going to go ahead and put my needle. You put a needle through. Now you can do either side, front or back. Doesn't really matter on the first one. That's why I always carry my little needle nose pliers. And then we're going to pull this up the string even. Now, how much string do you need to do a project? Depends on the length of the project. I do 4 times the length of the project is what you're going to need. So if you're doing 4 feet, you're going to need 16 feet of thread or 3 feet. So whatever it is, the length times 4 is the amount of thread I normally use. Now, normally you can go from here or in, either the left or right. It doesn't make any difference. It's just as long as you repeat it the same way. So if I come in from the left, I'm always going to do it from the left first. I usually go from the right side first. So I'm going to push that needle in. I'm going to twist this around. So I'm going to twist that needle in that way so you have about halfway. And then the needle's going to stay, the other needle, I'm going to push it in. I'm going to make an X. Now here's another pro tip. Rather than holding it by the needles and getting your stabbing fingertips, reach down and grab it by the needles, by the tail of the needle, and then you can push through. Then we're going to push through. We're going to drag it out. And then at the very end here, you see I left just a little bit of a loop. I'm going to take the inside, run it through that loop, and that's going to make a little knot. And that's what makes this stitch so strong. So if this breaks anywhere along here, I only lose this one stitch. I'm not going to lose the entire stitch, which is why it's so popular. And then combine that with the dropped in there. And then we'll do this, in, out, nice little there. Make sure you give yourself a little loop there. Boom. And then I tend to work the thread back and forth, give it a nice even tension so you get a nice clean stitch line. And then we're going to rinse and repeat. And this is what you would just keep doing this repeatedly over and over until you got to the length that you're done. I'm going to do one more, and then I'm going to show you a second way how to do this. So we're going to do this one more time. Loop through. And that's what you see here. We have a nice even there. So another way you can do this, sometimes it's the easier way to do it, is we're going to take one needle, go all the way through. Now at this point, you want to pull this out of the way, because if you leave it here on a tight needle, you'll puncture through that thread, and then you'll end up with a big knot, and you'll have a hole in the thread, and it's a real pain. So you pull it all the way out, run it through, pull it through, pull it out of the way, run it through. Now this one, and then you can do the same thing with the loop, but usually what happens is I do it like this way. I'll grab it, pull the whole thing out of the way, run it through, and then do the loop. So if I'm doing it this way, I'll do the knot about every other or third or fourth string. But I usually try to do the first style first. It's definitely the easier way to guarantee you're not going to stab your thread. So I prefer, just like we showed it the first time, X's, loop. All right, now I'm going to show you how we finish this off. So we're at the end here. So now what we're going to do is we're going to reverse backwards. So instead of me coming from this side, I'm going to come in from this side. We're going to push it in. And now we're going to do, now this time we're not going to do the knot or the loop. We're just simply going to back stitch it. Just like you would do on a sewing machine, if you will. Let me make sure that's still in view. And typically I go about back at least 3 holes to do my back stitching, sometimes 4, but 3 to 4 holes is a good. So for right now, because we're going on this small demo, so we're going to do one last one. So now that we back stitched, there's 2 options you can do. You can go ahead and just tie a standard square knot, you know, left over right, right over left. And if you're worried about strength or it pulling out or there, that's a good way to go. A more finished approach is we're just going to get a little scissors. We're going to cut that off. Then we're going to just take a standard Bic lighter. I might actually pull this out a little bit. Come on. It's cold. I'm out in my workshop. And we're just going to melt those edges and flatten it out. And now, as you see, we kind of had it's a little rough, I know, but we're there. Heck, I might even go ahead and do a nice on the bottom there. So now, the next thing I do, I'm going to do this in the video. So now that we got the stitch, I like to set the stitch in. A couple ways you can do this. You can do this with a roller, which is usually what I do. But you can also take your mallet This is all demo. This is not as sharp and clean as I would normally do. But you see there how it sets that into that groove. And that's the point of making that stitch line. And that is there. Let me see what I can do on a quickie here. I'm going to do a quick one on the bottom. Now, it's a lot easier to do it with that bigger hole that we discussed. And I'm just setting up my next needle here. I want to do that bottom thread. Show you one more time. So I'm doing my setup. Sometimes waxing the end of the thread is a good way to keep it from laying out when you're trying to get a needle in. And then, so that there'll be more. There's other stitches such as a corset stitch that we'll go over later. Not something I use a lot of. There's all kinds of a bajillion different stitches, baseball stitch, Mexican weaves, all kinds of fancy stitches that we may get into one day. So right here, this is why I always use my pliers. I have like no finger strength. Don't know why. Oh wait, I know why. I'm 44 and have arthritis. So as you see there, we're going to just do our string. Now when you're in the smaller hole, it's not as easy, and hence why I do that. Loop it through. I'm doing this just so you can see the difference between the two needles, because the size of the hole, the shape of the hole, as well as if you use a diamond punch versus an awl versus a straight edge, square, all makes a difference in the shape of the hole, and that all dictates how it's going to lay out. So if you want a nicer, cleaner look, I definitely prefer the stitch and irons. Let's do these real fast. I want to see, you guys get the benefit of practice on a single scrap. I jump straight into doing, let's just make pouches and bags, and the hardest stitching where I could, holes I could get. Now, if you don't want to make that knot loop every single time, that's okay too. But you want to do it at least every 4th or 5th, depending on the size of the project. It's typically what I do. And then I almost always will do the knots in any high stress area, corners, and such. So now we're almost done with this last one. I'm going to back stitch it real quick, and then we'll show you what the final. So as you see, making my X's, make the loop, tie in the knot, and then we're going to back stitch. Now this is why it's important to really make sure your pricking irons are straight. This is where I usually use the pull out technique, because with the smaller hole, it gets really tight when you have threads for back stitching it. And so I always keep a cheap pair of pliers. And that right there is why I do that hook, so I can see it's not going to, my thread is not going to just come flying off my needle. And believe me, when I first started, I used to do that a lot, and I got really annoying really fast. So I'm still going to be pulling this out of the way, because I don't want to stab through that thread. This is where you run the highest risk of doing that. It's with these small holes. Okay. And then I'm going to give it one last there. And so now we're going to do just like we discussed before. We're going to go ahead and leave it, just cut it close to flush. It doesn't take much. We're just going to heat that down and then flatten that out. And as you see, kind of the difference, this is why aesthetically I like the bottom line rather than the holes. If I was using thicker thread, or I was really double upping, or I'm using weird corners, that's where I would use the round. But for the most part, I use the stitch iron. Combine that, like I said, with, we're just gonna, now you can also, like I said, we have a roller, you can roll that down, and that's going to set into that. Hopefully you can see the difference, how it's flatter and drops into that groove line that we discussed, and that's the abrasion resistance. And that is a saddle stitch. Not a hard stitch at all, it just takes time and practice. And we'll definitely be seeing me doing that a lot in future videos. And with that, that is the end of part 2. Thank you for your time and putting up with these little experiments of mine. And I will see you guys next week. In the meantime, as always, stay crafty.